The writer, André, was going through a difficult phase in his career. His recent works hadn't achieved the expected success, and the pressure to create something innovative and impactful left him in a state of constant frustration. That cloudy afternoon, he decided to visit a small, used bookstore in the city center, hoping to find some inspiration. The bookstore, cramped and with the characteristic smell of aged paper, was nearly deserted. André wandered through the shelves, flipping through a few random books until something caught his attention. In the back of a dusty shelf, a titleless book with a worn leather cover and no markings seemed to be waiting for him. Curious, André picked up the book and opened it. The pages, yellowed with age, contained elegant but incomplete writing. It was a manuscript. There was something intriguing about those words, as if they concealed a deep and mysterious story waiting to be unraveled. As he headed to the counter to pay, the bookstore owner, an elderly woman with a tired look, glanced at the manuscript with a hint of concern. "Les book," she began in a raspy voice. "This isn't the first time I've sold it. People tend to return it, saying that it—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "That it causes strange events. Are you sure you want to take it?" André, who didn't believe in superstition, smiled confidently. "I'll take it. Maybe these strange events are exactly what I need to finish my next book." The woman simply nodded, handing him the book without further questions. André left the shop, feeling a mixture of excitement and slight apprehension, but nothing that shook his determination. At home, he sat at his desk and began to read the manuscript more carefully. The story described disturbing events in a small village in the European countryside, but the text abruptly stopped in the middle of a sentence. Something about the way the story was told captivated him, as if the words had their own energy, a life that pulsed between the lines. Feeling compelled to continue where the manuscript had left off, André picked up his pen and began to write. The moment the pen touched the paper, a strange sensation ran down his spine. The room seemed to have become colder, and he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper around him, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing on the words flowing onto the page. When he finally stopped writing hours later, he noticed that night had fallen. An absolute silence dominated the house. André looked at the manuscript, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. Something had changed in the atmosphere, but he couldn't identify what it was. Even so, he closed the book and went to bed, unaware that by bringing those words to life, he had awakened something far more sinister and profound than he could ever have imagined. The next morning, André woke up with his mind racing, the images of the manuscript still fresh in his memory. There was something about what he had written the night before that troubled him, but he couldn't pinpoint why. After breakfast, he returned to his office, determined to review what he had written. Upon opening the manuscript, he noticed something strange. The ink he had used appeared darker than usual, as if it had dried in an unusual way. But what caught his attention most was the last sentence he had written the night before. He was sure he had left it unfinished, but now it was complete, with words he didn't remember writing. He felt a cold presence behind him, as if something or someone was watching him. André frowned. That sentence didn't seem like his, and he wondered if, in his exhaustion, he might have continued writing without realizing it. Determined to ignore the oddity, he refocused, planning to continue the story. However, as he tried to put his ideas on paper, a growing sense of unease developed. It was as if the house had changed, quieter than usual, and the air seemed heavy, difficult to breathe. The pen trembled slightly in his hand, and each word written felt like a monumental effort. Suddenly, a soft sound caught his attention. It was a faint scratching coming from somewhere within the house. André stopped, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it ceased as quickly as it had started. Thinking it was just his imagination, he returned to writing, but soon realized he wasn't alone. The presence he had felt while writing the night before seemed stronger now, as if something invisible stood beside him, watching his every move. The feeling of being watched became almost unbearable, yet he couldn't stop. It was as if an invisible force compelled him to continue the story, to fill in the gaps left by the manuscript. As the hours passed, the subtle manifestations began to intensify. First, there were shadows that seemed to move in André's peripheral vision, disappearing as soon as he turned his head. Then, the whispers. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there, floating in the air around him, forming words he couldn't understand. Finally, the entire house seemed to have changed. The familiar and cozy environment he knew had become cold and hostile. The silence was oppressive, and the few sounds that did arise, the creak of the wood, the whisper of the wind at the windows, seemed amplified, charged with a sinister energy. André forced himself to continue writing, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that enveloped him. But when he looked at the clock and realized that the afternoon had already passed, he noticed something even more disturbing. The manuscript seemed to be completing itself. There were words, entire sentences that he didn't remember writing, but they were there, before his eyes. They were words that spoke of things he didn't know, but that somehow seemed true. They were stories of death and despair, of lost and condemned souls, as if the manuscript were telling the story on its own, using André as a mere vehicle. When he closed the book, a chill ran down his spine. Something was very wrong, and he knew he couldn't continue to ignore it. But a part of him, a curious, perhaps insane part, encouraged him to keep going, to discover where this story would lead. Little did he know that every word written was another step towards a fate from which there would be no return. That night, André tried to sleep, but sleep refused to come. The day's discomfort had left a deep mark, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as if the house itself was breathing around him. He tossed and turned in bed for hours, his thoughts fixated on the manuscript and the words that appeared on their own in the pages. Finally, after what seemed like hours of insomnia, he began to drift off. But the rest was interrupted by a subtle sound that infiltrated his dreams. It was a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, but enough to pull him back to consciousness. André opened his eyes, his heart pounding as the sound continued, repetitive, as if being uttered by a distant and persistent voice. He sat up in bed, trying to identify the source of the whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, echoing in the walls of the room. For a moment, he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind that night, and the whispers were too articulate, as if they were words, incomplete sentences he couldn't understand. Squinting into the darkness, André felt the familiar chill run down his spine. Something was definitely wrong. He got up, still groggy, and turned on the bedside lamp. The dim light made the shadows stretch across the walls, but the whispers didn't cease. With nerves on edge, he picked up the manuscript lying on the bedside table. He felt a coldness upon touching it, as if the book had been left outside, exposed to the cold wind. When he opened it, his mind raced through the words, looking for an explanation. But the pages were as enigmatic as ever. Suddenly, the The whispers changed tone, becoming more intense, almost aggressive. They were different now, not just random sounds, but clear, discernible words that invaded his ears like poison. "Keep writing," they said. "Complete the story." André felt an uncontrollable urge to do just that. It was as if something was taking over his will, pushing him toward the desk where his notebooks and pens waited. He tried to resist, but the words echoed in his mind, dominating all other thoughts. Back in the office, he sat at his desk, grabbed the pen with trembling hands, and began to write. The whispers grew in intensity, guiding his hand across the page, and the words flowed with an unsettling ease, as if someone were dictating every sentence. The stories that emerged were macabre, filled with terror and despair, things he had never imagined on his own. The night wore on, and André kept writing, unable to stop, each word feeling like a momentary relief from the growing pressure in his mind. But as he filled the pages, the supernatural manifestations around him intensified. The shadows in the room seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching and twisting on the walls, and the whispers, now coming from all corners, became a terrifying cacophony. Finally, exhausted and with his hand aching, André stopped. Silence fell like a heavy cloak over the house, but he knew he wasn't alone. He felt a presence in the room, something he couldn't see, but that was there, watching him. Slowly he turned, and for a moment his eyes caught a vague figure standing in the doorway, a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Trembling, he closed the manuscript and tried to calm his breathing, but the fear wouldn't leave him. He knew that the whispers, the shadows, all of it was just the beginning. Something had been awakened in that house, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. When he finally returned to bed, the whispers had ceased, but the feeling of being watched remained. André's eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, unable to close. He knew that when the sun rose, he would have to face the manuscript once again, even if it meant diving deeper into a nightmare that was only beginning. The day dawned gray and oppressive, reflecting André's mood. He had slept little, and the few hours of sleep had been tormented by disturbing dreams, full of unfamiliar faces and voices calling to him from dark places. Upon waking, he felt as if a heavy fog hung over his mind, making it difficult to think clearly. He spent the morning trying to focus on other things, but the memory of the whispers from the previous night was ever present, haunting his thoughts like a predator lurking in the shadows. He tried to shake off the feeling, attributing the events to a combination of stress and lack of sleep. But he knew deep down that something much more sinister was at play. As the afternoon wore on, the tension inside the house became almost palpable. The walls seemed to close in. The silence was suffocating, and the very air seemed charged with a strange energy. André felt the need to escape, to get out and breathe air that wasn't permeated with that oppressive sensation. He decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, trying to calm his nerves. The walk helped, albeit only temporarily, to clear his mind. However, as the sun began to set, a sense of urgency compelled him to return home. Something was wrong, he knew, and a part of him was terrified of what he might find upon his return. When he entered his house, the silence greeted him like an old enemy. Every sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and the dim light of dusk filtered through the windows, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. He forced himself to ignore the growing discomfort and went to the office where the manuscript awaited him, untouched on the desk. He sat down, hesitant, but something made him stop before opening the book. A sudden chill ran down his spine, as if a cold draft had passed through him. He looked toward the office window, where the twilight light mixed with the interior shadows. For a brief moment, his heart stopped. There was a shadow in the window, an indistinct shape that seemed to be watching him from outside. André froze, unable to look away. The shadow stood still, not moving, but there was something profoundly wrong with it. It wasn't a common shadow. It seemed to have density, a presence that went beyond what would be natural. And most disturbingly, he knew that if he approached to get a closer look, he would find no one outside. The house was in absolute silence, but the fear rising in his chest was deafening. He wanted to get up, to leave the office, but his body wouldn't obey. Everything inside him screamed to stay away from the window, but at the same time, something drew him toward that shadow, as if it had a magnetism he couldn't resist. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow moved. It didn't dissolve, but slid out of his field of vision, as if it had realized that André had noticed it. He jumped up, running to the window, but when he looked outside, he only saw the empty street and the streetlights beginning to turn on. There was no one there. André tried to calm himself, telling himself he had imagined it all, but the fear continued to pulse within him, uncontrollable. He knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that the shadow was real and that it was now inside the house, hidden somewhere among the ordinary shadows of the night. He returned to the office, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. He sat down at the desk again, but the desire to keep writing had vanished. The presence of the manuscript on the desk felt like a provocation, an invitation to dive back into that dark world from which the shadows had emerged. But André couldn't avoid it. With trembling hands, he opened the manuscript once more, determined to continue, but now with a deep fear, aware that each word written could bring forth something even worse than the shadow in the window. As he wrote, he couldn't help but cast furtive glances around the office, expecting the shadow to return. And although it didn't reappear that night, he knew it was nearby, waiting, watching, ready to manifest in even more terrifying ways. And with each word he wrote, the feeling that he was being drawn into something far beyond his control only intensified. André knew the shadow was just the beginning, and that by continuing the story, he was dangerously approaching a destiny he couldn't avoid. The days following the appearance of the shadow in the window were marked by a growing sense of paranoia. André tried to maintain a normal routine, but the presence he had felt that night seemed to haunt him constantly. The house, which had once been a refuge, now seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that watched him from every corner. He was increasingly isolating himself, avoiding external contacts and immersing himself in the pages of the manuscript, even though he knew it only worsened the situation. The words continued to emerge almost on their own, guiding his hands as he wrote, and the supernatural manifestations only intensified. Objects moved on their own, shadows danced on the walls, and the whispers became a constant, like a chorus of lost voices that only he could hear. It was on a rainy afternoon that the unexpected happened. The doorbell rang, and the sound, so familiar, seemed out of place in that tense environment. André, who wasn't expecting any visitors, hesitated before answering. He opened the door slowly and, to his surprise, found his old friend Raphael on the other side, wet from the rain, but with a welcoming smile on his face. "André," Raphael exclaimed, entering without waiting for an invitation. "It's been a while since we've seen each other. I thought it'd be good to pay you a visit. I hope you don't mind." André tried to smile, but he couldn't shake the strange feeling of discomfort. There was something comforting about seeing a familiar face, but at the same time, he felt as if Raphael's presence was somehow intruding on the space that had become so intimate in his darkness. Of course. It's good to see you, André replied, closing the door and trying to appear as natural as possible. Sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting visitors. Raphael laughed, shaking the water off his coat before hanging it up. Don't worry. I just wanted to see how you're doing. I heard you've been a bit reclusive, so I thought a little company wouldn't hurt. André led Raphael to the living room, where they sat down. The conversation started light, with Raphael talking about work, family, and the everyday things that used to matter to André, but now seemed to belong to another life, far removed from the reality he had been living in recent days. And you, André? How's the writing going? Raphael asked in a casual tone, but with a look that indicated genuine concern. André hesitated, feeling a pang of nervousness. It's going, he replied, trying not to give too many details. I've been working on something new, a little different from what I used to do. Raphael nodded, but his eyes seemed to penetrate through André's evasive words. He said, I had a strange dream a few nights ago, Raphael said, abruptly changing the tone of the conversation. I dreamed that you were writing something dangerous, something that shouldn't be completed. André felt his stomach turn. Raphael's words hit him with unexpected force, as if they had touched an open wound. What do you mean? André asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but unable to hide his anxiety. Raphael observed him for a moment before responding. In the dream, you were in a dark room, writing compulsively, and as you wrote, terrible things happened around you. It was as if the story you were creating was becoming real, but in a twisted, malevolent way. André tried to disguise the horror he felt upon hearing the description, but Raphael noticed his unease. I'm not saying I believe in dreams, André, but I've known you for a long time, and I can tell when something's wrong. This manuscript you're working on, there's something about it, isn't there? André avoided Raphael's gaze, focusing on his own hands that were trembling slightly. His friend's concern was real, but there was much more at stake than he could explain. How could he say that he felt as if he were being controlled by forces he didn't understand? How could he explain the things he had seen, heard, and felt in those lonely nights? Raphael leaned forward, his expression now more serious. Listen, if you need help, any kind of help, you know you can count on me, right? Don't isolate yourself more than you already have. Whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone. André finally lifted his gaze and met Raphael's. He desperately wanted to accept the offer, to tell him everything, but something inside him, perhaps the same impulse that forced him to keep writing, prevented him. I'll be fine, Raphael. I just need to finish this. After it's all done, I think things will get better. Raphael seemed unsatisfied with the answer, but didn't press further. They continued talking for a while longer, but the lightness of their earlier conversation had vanished, replaced by a weight that both could feel. When Raphael finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and placed a hand on André's shoulder. Take care, André. Don't let this consume you. I'm here if you need anything. André nodded, thanking him. But deep down, he knew that the battle he was facing was a solitary one. As he closed the door behind Raphael, the house seemed to breathe again, as if relieved by the intruder's departure. As night fell, André returned to the manuscript, but now with Raphael's words echoing in his mind. He knew he needed to continue, but with each page written, the line between reality and fiction became more blurred, and he began to question whether he would truly emerge unscathed from this story. The manuscript awaited him, and he knew the worst was yet to come. The days following Raphael's visit passed in a blur. André tried to maintain his routine, but the feeling of being watched, of something being wrong, never left him. He could feel the presence of the shadow, even when he couldn't see it. The nights were especially difficult, as the whispers returned to torment him, like a macabre melody that echoed in the darkest corners of the house. One night, exhausted from writing and unable to bear the growing weight of fear, André decided to do something he hadn't done in weeks: take a hot shower in hopes of relaxing and clearing his mind. He entered the bathroom and closed the door behind him, as if wanting to isolate himself from the rest of the world, even if only for a few minutes. The steam soon filled the room, creating a nebulous barrier between him and the rest of the house. The hot water was comforting, but it couldn't erase the tension that gripped his muscles. He closed his eyes, trying to focus only on the sensation of the water cascading over his skin, but a growing unease prevented him from fully relaxing. When he finally stepped out of the shower, he felt slightly better, as if the hot water had washed away some of the accumulated terror. However, when he looked at the fogged mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection seemed delayed. He wiped his hand across the mirror, clearing the steam to see better. For a moment, the image he saw looked normal. But then, when he moved, he noticed that the reflection took a fraction of a second to follow him. A chill ran down his spine. He tried to convince himself it was just exhaustion, that his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the discomfort grew with every passing second. André moved closer to the mirror, examining his own face closely. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, the result of sleepless nights and constant stress. But it wasn't that which bothered him. There was something different, something subtle but disturbing in the reflection. Then, it happened. The reflection smiled, a slow, forced smile that didn't match the neutral expression André kept on his face. He was paralyzed, unable to process what he was seeing. The smile in the reflection was cold, almost mocking, and the eyes that stared back at him from the other side of the glass didn't seem to be his. They were empty eyes, lifeless, as if the soul behind them wasn't his own. André took a step back, but the reflection remained where it was, smiling sinisterly. Fear gripped him, and his heart began to race uncontrollably. He wanted to back away, to run out of the bathroom, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. Suddenly, the smile disappeared, and the reflection began to mimic his movements again, as if nothing had happened. André felt on the verge of a breakdown. Had he imagined it all? Had the stress and lack of sleep finally affected his sanity? Trying to convince himself it had been just a hallucination, he stepped away from the mirror and dressed quickly, but the incident wouldn't leave his mind. That smile, those eyes, they weren't his. Something was terribly wrong, and he knew he couldn't simply ignore it. As he left the bathroom, the hallway seemed darker than usual, as if the light had been sucked away. He walked slowly to his bedroom, his eyes alert for any movement in the shadows around him. When he entered the bedroom, the first thing he did was cover the mirror on the dresser with a sheet. He didn't want to see his reflection anymore, not after what had happened. André lay down on the bed, but sleep didn't come. His mind was stuck in that moment in the bathroom, in the expression of that reflection that didn't seem to be him. He felt invaded, as if his very identity was being eroded by something unknown, something he had awakened by writing in the manuscript. He knew he couldn't continue like this. He needed to understand what was happening, but each time he thought of opening the manuscript again, he felt a growing dread, as if he was about to open a door to something much worse than he had already faced. As the night wore on, the silence in the house seemed heavier than ever, and André had the feeling that the shadow he had seen in the window was now inside him, watching his every move, waiting for the right moment to manifest again. And when sleep finally overtook him, he fell into an endless nightmare, where the reflection in the mirror watched him from afar, smiling, patiently waiting for him to make the next mistake. André's night was disturbed by unsettling dreams. However, upon waking, the feeling of terror did not dissipate as it usually did. It was as if the nightmare had followed him into the real world. The sinister reflection, the smile that wasn't his own, all were etched into his mind, making it impossible to forget what he had experienced. Despite the fear, something within him pushed him to keep writing. It was an insatiable need, a hunger that grew with every second. He knew the manuscript was the epicenter of everything that was happening, but instead of destroying it, as part of his mind begged him to do, he felt an almost uncontrollable compulsion to finish the story. So, on that gray morning, he locked himself in the office. He drew the curtains, avoiding any contact with the outside world. The dark room felt like a cocoon, isolating him from the rest of the house, where shadows moved freely. Sitting at the desk, André opened the manuscript. The words called to him, begging to be completed. He picked up the pen with a trembling hand and began to write. The first words came with difficulty, as if his mind resisted the act. However, once he started, the words began to flow frighteningly naturally. It was as if something was guiding his hand, leading him down an unknown and dark path. As he wrote, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air seemed heavier, colder, as if the room itself was reacting to his writing. The shadows on the walls began to elongate, moving erratically, dancing to an invisible and disturbing rhythm. André felt his breath grow shallow, but he continued to write, unable to stop. The words appeared on the page in handwriting that seemed different from his own. The events he described were macabre, full of despair and death, telling stories he didn't remember thinking of, much less creating. It was as if he were merely a channel, a tool, used to bring to life something beyond his understanding. Time passed without him noticing. Hours turned into minutes, and the day began to fade. The house, already submerged in darkness, seemed alive with the sounds of creaking wood and invisible winds whispering through the cracks. Yet, André was so immersed in the writing that he barely noticed when the objects in his office began to move on their own. First, there was a slight tremor in the lamp. Then the chair beside him slid a few inches, as if something had bumped into it. André glanced briefly, but saw nothing. He tried to focus on the words, but fear began to erode his concentration. He felt surrounded, as if something invisible was lurking in the shadows, watching every letter he wrote. Soon, the trembling in the objects intensified. Books fell from the shelves, papers were scattered across the floor, and the lamp finally toppled, extinguishing the only remaining light in the room. Darkness engulfed the space, and the only light came from the small desk lamp, casting a weak, yellowish glow over the manuscript. André paused for a moment, his wide eyes fixed on the shadows, moving as if they had a life of their own. He could hear whispers, soft and distant, but at the same time they seemed to come from within his own mind. The sense of dread was suffocating, but something inside him forced him to continue. His hand returned to the paper, but now the writing was frantic, almost desperate. The words poured from the pen like an uncontrollable torrent, and as he wrote, the whispers around him intensified, transforming into a deafening cacophony. It was as if the walls of the house were alive, echoing the screams of tormented souls. Finally, in one last effort, André dropped the pen. He was sweating, his heart racing, and his mind on the brink of collapse. He looked at the manuscript, now filled with pages of indescribable horror. He felt a mix of relief and fear as he saw that for now, the writing had stopped. But the peace didn't last. The silence that fell over the room was even more terrifying than the whispers. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, André heard the sound he feared more than any other. The sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing through the corridors. André knew at that moment that the nightmare was only just beginning. What he had unleashed with his writing was now manifesting in reality, and he had no idea what he was about to face. But one thing was certain: the manuscript was not finished, and until it was, he knew he would have no peace. André was exhausted, mentally and physically, but fear kept him awake. The words he had written were still fresh in his mind, an endless stream of terror that seemed rooted in his very soul. The sound of heavy footsteps he had heard moments before had ceased, but the silence that remained was even more oppressive. He felt like a trapped animal, waiting for the predator to finally reveal itself. He rose from the desk with difficulty, his muscles stiff with tension. Every movement seemed to attract the attention of something invisible around him, as if the house itself was watching his every gesture. He tried to convince himself that the footsteps were a figment of his imagination, but reality seemed increasingly distant and the terror more palpable. André left the office, his sweaty hands trembling as he gripped the doorknob. The hallway was shrouded in shadows, and he hesitated before moving forward. It felt as though the air was denser, almost suffocating, and each step he took was like wading through an invisible swamp. The dim light of a lamp at the end of the hall seemed like a mirage, a promise of safety he knew was false. As he walked, he began to hear the whispers again, but this time they didn't come from the walls or the shadows. They came from within his own head, a cacophony of voices intertwining, forming disjointed and terrifying words. He pressed his temples, trying to block out the sounds, but they only grew louder, as if mocking his attempt to escape. He reached the end of the hallway and entered the bedroom. The unmade bed looked like an invitation to rest, but André knew that rest was beyond his reach. He sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze lost somewhere between the shadows. He felt disconnected from reality, as if he were floating between the world of the living and the dead, unable to anchor himself in either. The whispers continued, and now they were clearer, closer. He could make out words, entire phrases that made no sense, but at the same time seemed to carry a deep and terrible meaning. The voices spoke of pain, of death, of fates sealed by wrong choices. And all these voices seemed directed at him, as if judging him for something he had yet to understand. Suddenly, the environment around him changed. The bedroom walls began to distort, as if they were made of a malleable material, and the shadows stretched, transforming into vaguely human figures. André blinked, trying to dispel the vision, but it persisted, and he realized he was trapped in a waking nightmare. The figures approached slowly, their faces indistinguishable, but their presences were overwhelming. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed. The shadows around him stretched, bending toward him, as if they wanted to envelop him, consume him. He felt small, helpless, at the mercy of something far beyond his comprehension. In the midst of this terror, one figure stood out from the rest. It was a woman, or at least it seemed to be. Her form was more defined, but her face was shrouded in a veil of shadows. She approached slowly, and with each step she took, the ground beneath André seemed to dissolve, as if he were about to fall into a bottomless abyss. When the figure stopped before him, André felt a wave of despair so intense it nearly made him faint. The woman raised her hand, and he saw that she was holding something, the manuscript. But this was not the same one he had written. It was burning slowly, but without consuming itself. "Finish it," said the voice, a blend of all the whispers he had heard before, but unified in a cold and merciless tone. André wanted to scream, wanted to back away, but he was frozen in place. The figure extended the burning manuscript toward him, and he felt the heat of the flames, but it was not an ordinary heat. It was the heat of despair, of agony, of loss. When he finally managed to move his hands, he reached out, almost against his will, and took the burning manuscript. The moment his fingers touched the paper, the world around him exploded into a cacophony of lights and shadows. The bedroom walls dissolved into darkness, and he was thrown into a vortex of voices, screams, and malevolent laughter. It was as if he were falling into a bottomless pit, where reality itself disintegrated. And then, everything stopped. André woke up suddenly, lying in bed, drenched in sweat. The bedroom was back to normal, the shadows now just shadows, and the walls were still. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the feeling of terror wouldn't leave him. He turned in bed and saw the manuscript beside him, intact, with no sign of burns. The presence that had tormented him moments before seemed to have vanished, but he knew it was temporary. Something was lurking, waiting for him, and the only way to face it was to finish what he had started. But when he picked up the manuscript and opened it to the last written page, he noticed something that made his heart stop for a second. The words he had written the previous night were no longer there. In their place was a new narrative, darker and more disturbing than anything he had ever created. And now he knew he was no longer in control. The manuscript had a life of its own, and it was shaping his reality in ways he could not predict. The waking nightmare had begun, and there was no more escape. André stared at the pages of the manuscript with a mix of horror and fascination. The words now filling the pages weren't his, not in the usual sense. They told a story of darkness, pain, and despair. A story that seemed to be written by an external force, an entity that was merely using his hand as an instrument. What he read was a detailed account of shattered lives, of condemned souls, and of an ancient curse that had long awaited being awakened. The weight of those words was suffocating, as if each letter carried a fragment of a terrible truth that he was only beginning to comprehend. André knew he needed to discover the origin of the manuscript, to understand the nature of the evil he had unleashed. He felt his sanity hanging by a thread, but something within him drove him to seek answers, even if it led him to a deeper abyss. Determined to find the truth, André left the house for the first time in days. The bookstore where he had found the manuscript was his only clue. The rain poured down heavily as he walked through the deserted streets, but the cold water seemed irrelevant compared to the ice that gripped his heart. Each step seemed to take him closer to the unknown, but he knew he couldn't stop. When he finally arrived at the bookstore, it seemed different. The dim lights gave the place an even gloomier appearance, and the silence inside was almost tangible. The woman who had sold him the manuscript was at the counter, as if she had been waiting for him. Her eyes, once just tired, now seemed deeply troubled, as if she knew exactly what he had been through. "You've returned," she said, her voice heavy with a gravity that made the hairs on the back of André's neck stand on end. "I need to know," André began, trying to keep his voice steady, but feeling it waver. "Where did this manuscript come from? What is it, really?" The woman sighed, as if she had expected the question but hesitated to give the answer. "This manuscript is much older than it appears," she began, her eyes fixed on André's. "It was written by a man centuries ago, a writer like you, desperate to create something that would make him immortal. He found a way to do it, but the price was his soul." A chill ran down André's spine. He invoked something, an entity, to give him the power to create an eternal masterpiece, and he succeeded. But what he didn't know was that the price would be higher than he could ever imagine. The entity he invoked wasn't just interested in his soul, but in all the souls that would be touched by his words. Since then, the manuscript has passed from hand to hand, each writer trying to finish it, but all failing, doomed to become part of the story it tells. André felt his heart tighten in his chest. The horror stories he had read on the pages now made sense. They were accounts of people who had tried to finish the manuscript before him, all dragged into the same terrible fate. "I've seen things," he murmured, more to himself than to the woman. "Things that can't be real." "They are real, André," she said, in a tone that left no room for doubt, "and the only way to escape this curse is to destroy the manuscript before completing it. But no one has managed to do that so far. The entity that created it won't allow it to be destroyed so easily. It feeds on fear, on despair, and will use every possible means to prevent you from destroying the manuscript." André felt the hopelessness grow within him. He had tried to burn the manuscript, but it seemed indestructible, as if protected by a force beyond human understanding. "What should I do?" he asked, feeling increasingly lost. The woman looked at him with an expression of regret. I don't know, André. Everyone who has tried to finish the story or destroy it before has been consumed by it. But you still have a chance. The manuscript isn't complete yet. If you can find a way to break the cycle, to finish the story without succumbing to the darkness, perhaps you can free yourself, but it won't be easy. The entity knows your fears, your desires, and will use all of it against you." André left the bookstore with his mind in turmoil. The rain continued to fall, but he barely felt it. The woman's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the whispers he had heard in the house. The entity knew everything. It knew his fears, his weaknesses, and now he was in a race against time to find a solution before it was too late. When he arrived home, André felt more isolated than ever. The darkness seemed thicker, more threatening. He knew the entity was there, waiting, watching. The manuscript lay on the table, silent, but full of a malignant promise. André knew he didn't have much time. He needed to find a way to finish the story without falling into the entity's traps. But with every passing minute, he felt weaker, more vulnerable. He sat before the manuscript, his hands trembling. He was trapped in an infernal cycle, and the truth revealed had brought no relief, only a new level of terror. The entity had chosen him, and now he needed to find a way to escape a fate that seemed sealed. But as he looked at the blank pages before him, a new idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps there was a way to finish the story that the entity didn't expect, something that could break the cycle and free him from the curse. But to do so, he would need to dive even deeper into the abyss, risking all that remained of his sanity. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind ablaze, André picked up the pen and began to write once more, determined to find a way out, even if it meant facing the worst of his fears. Night fell over André's house like a suffocating shroud, and he knew this would be the decisive night. The shadows that had once moved on the walls now seemed bolder, closer, as if they were preparing to strike the final blow. The manuscript lay open before him, the pen ready in his hand, but the words he needed to write seemed to elude his mind. The revelation at the bookstore had ignited a spark of hope, but also of terror. André knew he was in a race against time, and the entity inhabiting the manuscript was determined to prevent him from escaping. He felt its presence in every dark corner of the house, in the whispers that were now constant, in the objects that moved on their own. But the worst of all was the growing sense that his own sanity was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. As he stared at the pages of the manuscript, the idea that had begun to take shape in his mind the day before solidified. He knew he couldn't finish the story in the traditional way. If he did, the entity would win. But what if he subverted its expectations? What if, instead of giving the entity the ending it expected, he wrote something entirely different? Something that could break the cycle? Taking a deep breath, André began to write. The first words came hesitantly, but soon the story began to take shape. He wrote about a man, a writer, who finds a cursed manuscript. The man, like him, is haunted by an entity that desires his soul, that feeds on his fear. But instead of succumbing to the terror, the man finds a way to deceive the entity, to trap the curse back within the pages of the manuscript, where it could no longer cause harm. As he wrote, André felt a growing resistance, as if an invisible force was trying to stop his pen from moving. The pressure in his mind increased, the shadows around him agitated more intensely, and the whispers became screams, desperate to stop him. But he persisted, focusing on every word, every sentence, forcing himself to ignore the chaos around him. The scene in the house began to deteriorate rapidly. The walls seemed to vibrate, as if they were about to collapse. The shadows became almost tangible, snaking toward him like dark claws. André could feel their coldness, the malice emanating from their distorted forms. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, as he was about to complete the last sentence, the lamp beside him exploded in a shower of glass, plunging the office into total darkness. The only remaining light was that of his small desk lamp, flickering, threatening to go out at any moment. Panic rose in his chest, but he knew he couldn't afford to feel fear. The entity was closing in, and he could feel it beside him, ready to claim his soul. With one last effort, André wrote the final sentence. And with these words, the entity was forever imprisoned within the pages of the story, where it could no longer cause harm. The moment the pen finished the final period, an ear-piercing scream echoed through the house, an inhuman sound, full of rage and pain. The shadows around him twisted violently, as if being pulled by an irresistible force. André fell from his chair, exhausted, as the manuscript before him began to move. The pages turned on their own, the text glowed with a spectral light. The shadows, once omnipresent, began to be sucked back into the book, screaming in protest as they were imprisoned. The house shook, but now it was as if a storm was being contained within the manuscript. When the last remnant of shadow was swallowed by the pages, the manuscript closed with a thud, and silence fell over the house. The air felt lighter, as if the oppressive weight had been lifted. André lay on the floor, breathing heavily but feeling a deep sense of relief. He had done it. Somehow, he had done it. With difficulty, he got up and looked at the manuscript, now inert on the table. There was no longer a malevolent presence in it, no sense of imminent danger. But he knew he couldn't just leave it there. The entity was trapped, but the manuscript was still a dangerous object. Gathering his last bit of strength, André took the manuscript and carried it outside. The rain had stopped and the sky was clear, as if the storm had passed. He walked to a nearby vacant lot, where he lit an improvised fire. Without hesitation, he threw the manuscript into the flames and watched as it burned, the pages curling and turning to ash. As the flames consumed the manuscript, André felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The entity was destroyed, and he was free. He watched the fire until the last trace of the manuscript disappeared, and only then did he allow himself to relax, letting the weight of his experience finally dissipate. But deep in his mind, a small doubt lingered. Was it really over? Or was the entity somehow still lurking, waiting for a new opportunity? André pushed those thoughts away, determined not to let fear rule him again. He was free, at least for now.